Petter, a large portion of the training that pilots undergo, is carried out to allow us to behave nearly instinctively when faced with, for example, managing issues. However, what occurs when those instinctive responses become into the exact item that initially started the problems? Stay tuned. The pilot scheduled to pilot Flight 4439 of Republic Airways arose at almost 9 in the morning. The 6th of November, 2019. The first flight was set for a leisurely 1500 hours local time, and they were lodging at a motel. It had made it possible for the team to have a lengthy sleep-in, and they reported feeling upbeat and refreshed after taking the shuttle that goes to the airport. It was a lovely day with nearly clear sky and mild winds. Stately enough for a flight, that is. The 32-year-old captain had been employed by the airline for a duration of just over 4 years. Out of the 4,500 hours he completed, 3,135 were spent in flight on the family of Embraer 170. An initial officer, 30 years of age, who had begun with Republic a little more than a year before to the journey. This indicated that he had only been around for around 2,300 hours. And on the Type 677, that day before, the pilots had gotten along quite well. This marked their inaugural flight together. In addition, the first officer had flown as a pilot for 2 of the 3 legs, indicating that on the next day, the captain had the responsibility to initiate and lead both legs. We would only deviate from this rule in the event that our operational factors, such as inclement weather and training, or restrictions at airports, for instance. The plane that the crew was planning to fly was now an Embraer J170, 12 years old. This beautiful regional plane can accommodate up to 70 people, including a trimmable horizontal stabilizer and undermounted engines. This will be crucial to this narrative, because there was a lengthy history of problems with this specific aircraft. Many problems with the trim setup. In the months preceding takeoff, the captain's control yoke's trim switch had often ceased operating, giving the pilots an ICA's warning. For engineers, these kinds of intermittent failures may be quite unpleasant. Who, due to the nature of their employment, must collaborate with them, is by adhering to a very certain set of guidelines based on the type of failure, something they have to deal with. And after doing the task, they will test the system. Moreover, if the system indicates that the error has been fixed, the aircraft will thereafter be made available till that exact same flaw rears itself again. On the day of this flight, however, no issues were mentioned. Moreover, the technical logbook was spotless. What, then, was the real situation here? In order to clarify that, we must first examine into the true nature of the pitch trim mechanism and how it operates. As you can see, the pitch trim system is an essential part in operating contemporary airplanes, since it allows us to, with a broad array of various speeds and weights, primary control is given to the aircraft around the pitch axis with the use of its elevators. These little rudders are located behind the horizontal stabilizer, which, when moved, modifies the force produced by downforce across the stabilizer's horizontal and causes the airplane to tilt up or down. However, the issue lies in the required elevator deflection and the prolonged, continuous pull or push on the yoke, as the plane is either ascending or lowering, is quite taxing for pilots. This is because, after using the elevators to accomplish the desired pitch, in which case they might employ the trim method, in order to adjust the horizontal stabilizer, the entire back wing, into a fresh perspective that may hold this new inclination. This indicates a decrease in the forces acting on the yoke, until almost no inputs are required. And that's what it means for the airplane to be in trim, according to us pilots. Much work goes into instructing pilots during their first training. Should always reduce the aircraft's size, since it will be much easier to manage, and, if done correctly, to function. Every time the airplane changes its speed, which is plainly visible on the Boeing 737, by rotating the large trim wheels, both when the pilots and while the airplane is being flown by its autopilot. Trim wheels are not present on the Embraer, but rather a movable trim scale that indicates the stabilizer's angle. One very crucial feature of the Embraer 170 is that the stabilizer may now be manipulated in 4 distinct methods, either by the captain's left thumb or by a split trim switch nearby, either on his yoke or the matching yoke of the first officer. or by a few backup switches, either by the autopilot in the end or on the central control panel. The switches are divided into two halves in order to ensure that the staff intentionally moves the switch and is not triggered. Memory items are now activities that the pilots must commit to memory, such as a short circuit in the connection to the switch, and take immediate action should a certain major failure occur. That is a crucial moment. When dealing with a cut runway, Republic Airlines could only recall one thing. This was to operate either yoke's red trim fast disconnect switch. After that, the movement would cease of the electric motor driving the horizontal stabilizer. Following completion of the memory items, next, the staff is expected to make use of the fast reference card. It's a little card with more steps to take. The quick reference handbook came next, for the whole list of errors. As pilots, we are trained to identify and manage a trim runway every few years in the simulator. If detected at an early stage, it usually doesn't pose a significant problem. That is the way the system functions. Additionally, it mentions a few safety measures but doesn't go into detail. What was the situation with this specific aircraft? Why, despite all efforts, did the captain's trim switch continue to malfunction? The engineers attempted to swap out parts and solve its problems? Nevertheless, none had seen that the wiring bundles descending to the trim computer from the trim switch were placed in close proximity to the securing bolt of the yoke of the commander. The bolt was securely fastened in place, utilizing a metallic wire that has been twisted itself into a pigtail, but it wasn't neatly tucked in. Rather, the pigtail had begun to rub against the bundle of wires and gradually eroding the insulation, resulting in the exposure of the wire and sporadic short circuits. Naturally, though, the pilots in flight on this particular day were unaware of this. While they prepared for their trips, first leg, about 1400 hours local time, the pilots began preparing for takeoff at the Metro Wayne County Airport in Detroit. The quality of all the documentation was excellent, and nothing that stands out too much. They then went ahead and briefed their cabin staff and proceeded towards the airplane. As I previously stated, the captain would begin as a pilot flying throughout the initial portion of the journey to New York LaGuardia Airport, after which the lead officer would take control and pilot it to Atlanta, after which the captain would eventually return it to their home base at LaGuardia again. They began loading up their passengers. Then they left for New York at about 5 o'clock. Both the takeoff and the early ascent were perfectly typical, with the pilot operating the aircraft by hand, exactly like he always did during the first several thousand feet. Any flight's first phase requires the airplane to proceed through many pitch adjustments, accelerating into a lower pitch to retract the flaps. And after that, the pitch will change to attain the speeds required for the ensuing climbing stages. The captain was flying this section by hand, thus he would have needs to be trimming all the time, utilizing the yoke's trim switch. However, it is unlikely that he would have considered this. It's merely a normal action for him to take because he could have grown accustomed to it from many years of aviation. Furthermore, this is much the same as what you do when you go riding, and you have to turn now, as though you are not required to consider what you are doing. We experience it that way when we adjust the plane. Following the aircraft's successful establishment in cruise and autopilot, abruptly, a warning message flashed on the ICA's monitor. Pitch trim switch 1 fail was the message, once more showing that the trim switch on the captain's ship was malfunctioning. When the plane was operating smoothly on autopilot, the pilots talked this signal and reviewed the relevant checklist. This was essentially silent save from the advising nature of the notice. They didn't see why this failure warranted changing the controls. Rather, they began getting ready for the LaGuardia approach, without giving it any more thought. Upon arriving at the gate, the captain made touch with, letting them know about the ICA's notice through their maintenance department. And he also noted the malfunction in the technical record of the aircraft. This marked the beginning of the series that would eventually build up to the extremely dangerous occurrence that is the subject of this film. But the engineers got to the plane fast and got to work before I could tell you the specifics. On the faulty switch, it was informed to the pilots that the backup switch that was required was around 20 minutes distant, within a warehouse, and as the pilots Whilst they waited, the engineers partially undid the outdated switch. But eventually, as the engineers worked, the airplane was able to fly flawlessly, utilizing the first officer system or the backup switches. Hence, rather than completing the task, it was instructed to the engineers to remount the switch. And then they needed to complete what's called an HIL release. HIL is now an acronym for Hold Item List, and it implies that some non-essential maintenance components can be added to a list for future fixing. Each maker of aircraft is free to determine what may be added safely to the HIL list and the amount of time the aircraft can be operated. Before it has to be corrected, it must be put on the inoperative system with these problems to remind the team not to use it. However, there is an issue with doing that. Is that the trim switch is on the yoke, and the INOP sticker isn't really able to be attached there in a nice way. Was never made to fit. Additionally, there was no method to fully disable that one switch. However, as it had been operating without issue on the trip-in, it wasn't noticed as genuinely significant. After that, the pilots received a briefing on the activities that had been done, and the captain confirmed the technical logbook's accuracy had been appropriately completed. No one tested the switch's functionality following its remounting, since, in any case, it wasn't intended to be utilized. The engineers then departed the airplane. Then the cabin staff began loading the departing travelers, who planned to travel to Atlanta. For the next leg, the first officer would be the pilot in flight, and the plane quickly withdrew. They began their day's second flight. This flight was conducted without any issues. Any issues, as well as the cautionary note, did not surface throughout the flight. The crew performed a routine turnaround for the final flight of the day in Atlanta. It was going to be pilot flying for the captain once more. This final flight had extremely few passengers scheduled. There were just 6 of them, hence throughout the incident flight, there were just 9 passengers. 2 pilots, 1 cabin staff member, and 6 passengers. The pilots made a decision after calculating the takeoff performance to execute a traditional flap 2 departure, around 2050 local time as well. The plane retreated from the gate and activated its motors. The most recent Atlanta weather was rather pleasant, with only a few gentle easterly breezes. It was 15 degrees Celsius outdoors with only a few thin, extremely high clouds. After the aircraft taxied out at 21:05, the thrust levers were advanced by the skipper and started the runway 09 left takeoff roll. Soon after takeoff, the plane began to ascend quickly, almost 4,000 feet per minute, which was expected considering the extremely low passenger weight that they were transporting. Once more operating the aircraft by hand, the captain reached a height of around 1,500 feet. He began tilting the plane forward. Should speed up in order to initiate the flap retractions. When the nose began to run, he requested the first officer for flaps 1 to decrease, and the pace began to pick up. Due to its little weight, the aircraft was ascending, requiring him to pitch forward due to a rather high pitch angle. Quite a bit in order to lessen that. Consequently, he had to apply some trim, which he did, using his yoke's trim switches, which he had already performed thousands of times. The airplane began trimming now, even though the trim switch was not meant to be utilized. However, the stresses on the yoke, diminishing progressively, the exact opposite, began to take place. The controls were becoming increasingly cumbersome, and he was now in need of to advance with increasing vigor in order to reduce the climb rate. The pilot's first response at this point was to glance down at the trim indicator and realize. His shock was that it was actually moving, but not in the manner he had intended. The nose-up posture of the trim was becoming more and more apparent. At first, the first cop saw nothing while what was happening. One of the problems with the stabilizer trim issue is this. It must be expressed very clearly by the pilot, who becomes aware of it because to the lack of sight or auditory alerts in the event that it happens while the autopilot is not on. At this point, the captain called the first officer to activate the autopilot. However, as soon as he attempted to do so, it disengaged owing to the forces being exerted to the captain's yoke. The autopilot switch was left by the first officer for some while and prepared to change to the new frequency for air traffic control. Suddenly, the captain cried out, "Well, there's an issue. Is it possible to contact air traffic control in an emergency? It makes sense that the first officer would say, "What? Why? If there is an emergency, whom should I call?" Furthermore, the captain stated, at 21 hours 6 minutes and 53 seconds, the first emergency contact was made. "I think that we have a runaway stabilizer." Was sent to Atlanta Tower. In response, the tower inquired about the nature of about the emergency and extended an offer of whatever help they could give. When a distress call is received, the aircraft in the will be given top attention, and that is precisely what has transpired as of late. Atlanta Tower requested that the airplane turn right for a downwind immediately, for a landing on runway 10 or any other runway that they may require, but sadly, things were not going to be just that easy, since the trim condition in the cockpit was now getting become severe while using the horizontal stabilizer. As the airplane is pitched up, finally arriving at the highest nose-up position of 13 degrees. The captain had to exert all of his might at this time to maintain the nose from gradually moving higher. He yelled at flaps, and after that, he manually raised the flaps to check if that would remedy the problem, but it didn't help. Then, in an attempt to bring the nose down, he requested the first officer for assistance. And both pilots began to advance with all of their might at this point. Nonetheless, the aircraft's nose continued to rise, increasing its speed as it did was diminishing swiftly. The captain had determined that a runaway stabilizer was the cause of the failure. He then began to use the memory pieces. It essentially meant that he shoved the fast trim disconnect switch on it of stress the pilots were experiencing at the moment. Following nearly 2 complete 360-degree spins. 21 hours 10 minutes and 40 seconds was the moment the skipper turned over the first officer's controls. At that point, the plane was still twisting and ascending through around 10,000 feet. And at that moment, the incident had been ongoing for around 5 minutes. As soon as the first cop gained possession, he began trying to use his personal trim switch to advance the airplane, and fortunately, it began to function, and the yoke's powers at last began to ease off. Before the first officer, the aircraft reached its peak height of 14,830 feet. Had everything completely in control. He then proceeded to make a broad right turn. They began to follow the directions Atlanta Tower was providing them with, as a means of returning to runway 10. Now, the captain perused the quick reference card, but instead of both of them determined that after finishing the checklist they didn't need to troubleshoot because the aircraft was already under control. It further note that even if the first acts during the vectors caused the captain to momentarily the backup trim switch appeared to be functioning okay when I tried it. Thus, at 21 hours 14 minutes and 30 seconds, he made the decision to regain control from the initial officer. It took only a few moments. Once he assumed control prior to the flight data recorder once more began to record several trim-up orders coming from the yoke of the captain. And he had to start moving forward once more in order to manage the pitch. But this time, the pilots responded more quickly. Then the captain gave the first officer back control of the controls, who was able to adjust the airplane. Why the captain chose to retake control at that moment is unknown, as it is evident that the first officer handled the airplane without any issues, although there were no longer any references to any conversations with the cabin personnel and the pilot's passengers as all of this was going on. However, I assume that when they were able to control the airplane and they having made a decision, there is no doubt, thus they must have spoken with them, that the travelers on this aircraft would have realized there was a big issue and they would have probably been very upset. Why did the aircraft's trim begin to go away as soon as the pilot took over the manual controls, but not during the initial flight of the officer? Nevertheless, further analyses examined the trim switch's wiring, shown the damages that I had previously described to you. How to operate the trim switch. It would have been extremely difficult to break the ingrained behaviors that he had developed, and that was what caused to the emergence of the occurrence. As a result, conversations over whether or not it was a very wise decision to permit dispatch with a defective, still activated trim switch. If you find this video appealing, I hope you have granted me a subscription. Then after that, I think you're going to discover this video really interesting, or view every video I've posted on accidents in my playlist. If you would want to help me with the work I do, please think about joining. To my Patreon community, a huge thank you. Or grab yourself some great merch. I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.